her thin fingers still wrapped around the warm metallic band he had placed in her hands, the symbol of a protection she did not understand and did not believe she deserved. The red emergency lights, mixed now with the cold blue of the station's defense systems powering up, painting every face in shifting colors, turning the moment into something that felt like the edge of history. Above them, the transparent ceiling showed distant flashes where the unidentified fleet had formed a dark line against the stars, unmoving, waiting, as if even the unknown enemy had paused to witness the decision. The lead security officer's voice came again, sharper than before, announcing that only 30 seconds remained, and with those words the political weight of the galaxy pressed down harder, because this was no longer only about a seat or a girl or a broken protocol. It was about whether humanity would enter the interstellar community as a cooperative ally or as an unpredictable force that placed emotion above order. The gathered delegates watched with calculated stillness, some already preparing the statements they would send if the human chose defiance. Others leaning forward with a strange new curiosity because no species had ever challenged the social hierarchy so openly on their first day. The girl felt all of it like a storm inside her fragile body. She knew the stories of how first contact shaped the future of entire civilizations. She knew that alliances determined survival when threats appear at the edge of known space. And now a real fleet had arrived, making unity more necessary than ever. She could not allow herself to become the reason a species stood alone in a hostile galaxy. The old lessons returned. With cruel clarity, the quiet voice that had followed her since childhood, telling her that the correct choice was always to remove herself, to make things easier for others, to accept invisibility as her natural state. Her legs trembled as she forced herself to step back from him. Her eyes lowered, her voice barely forming the words that he must go, that she released him from whatever promise he believed he had made, that she would return to her assigned sector, and no one would speak of this. Again, it was the speech she had given in 100 different forms across her life, but this time it felt like tearing something living out of her chest. The human listened without interrupting, and for a moment she thought she saw pain in his expression, not the pain of losing a political advantage, but something deeper, the pain of seeing someone willingly accept their own erasure. The officer began the final count, 10 seconds, and the hall seemed to contract around that number. Every camera, drone focused, every transmission channel open. The entire station balanced on the edge of the human's next movement. He looked toward the illuminated path that led to the council chamber, a path lined with honor guards and high officials, the future that had been prepared for him. And then he looked back at the girl who was already trying to step away, her shoulders curved inward. The symbol of his world held like something fragile and temporary, and in that instant the choice became visible, not only to him, but to everyone watching, because it was no longer about disobeying a protocol, it was about deciding what kind of power humanity believed in. The count reached 3, and the officer's hand moved toward the command that would restrict the human delegation. The girl closed her eyes, unable to watch the moment she would become invisible again, and then the human moved, not toward the shining path, but toward her. His step calm and unhurried as if time itself had slowed to match his decision. He stopped in front of her and gently lifted her hand, closing her fingers more firmly around the metallic band, as if anchoring it there. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the hall without the need for amplification. He said that humanity did not measure worth by strength or status, but by the simple fact of being alive and capable of feeling. That any council which required the abandonment of one individual in order to begin its work was not a council he could recognize as legitimate, and that he would attend their meeting only under one condition, that she would walk beside him as an equal, not as an exception. The words fell into the hall with a force greater than the emergency alarms. The final second of the countdown passed without the expected compliance, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. The entire system seemed to freeze between two possible futures. Then the officer's command channel filled with overlapping transmissions from the council itself. Urgent, divided, some demanding immediate sanctions, others advising caution. because even those who had built the rigid social structure understood the symbolic danger of punishing a species for an act of compassion while an unknown fleet waited outside their borders. The guards hesitated, their training colliding with the uncertainty of their leaders, and in that hesitation the human extended his arm toward the path once more, not as an invitation to the council, but as an invitation to the girl. She stared at him in disbelief, her mind unable to accept that the choice had truly been made, that someone had placed her existence above political safety, above reputation, above fear. Her entire life had taught her that such a thing was impossible, and yet the hall was still watching, still waiting, and the symbol in her hand was real and warm. She took a step forward, then another, her movements unsteady but growing stronger as she realized that no one was stopping her. The guards were not blocking the path. The officials were not speaking. The silence that had once been the mark of her isolation had become a silence of witness. And as she reached his side, he did not lead her. As a protector leads the weak, he matched his pace to hers, walking beside her so that every camera and every watching eye would record them as equals moving toward the center of power together. The effect on the crowd was immediate and profound. Some beings lowered their heads in what might have been the first gesture of respect she had ever received. Others watched with expressions that carried the beginning of a new understanding, because the definition of importance had shifted in front of them. Above the station, the unknown fleet advanced another measured distance into defensive range, the external cannons locking targets. The political crisis now tied completely to the moral one unfolding inside the hall. And as the human and the once unwanted girl walked toward the council, chamber doors, those massive doors, began to open slowly, not in command but in response, as if the structure itself had recognized the weight of the choice that had just been made. In the widening light beyond them waited the leaders of the galaxy, forced now to confront not only a new species, but a new idea of value that threatened to change everything they believed about power and belonging. The council chamber was older than most civilizations that now depended on its decisions. A vast circular structure suspended in the heart of the station like a second sun. Its walls formed from living crystal that recorded every word ever spoken inside it. And as the doors closed behind the human and the Luma girl, the noise of the outer hall vanished into a deep, watchful silence. The kind of silence that did not belong to peace, but to judgment. Tier after tier of delegates rose around them in glowing platforms, each species marked by its own colors and symbols of authority. And at the highest level, the High Council itself waited in a ring of white light, their forms blurred by the energy field that protected their identities from public reading, a reminder that power often hid its true face. The girl felt the weight of that chamber pressing down on her fragile shoulders, every instinct telling her that she did not belong in a place where decisions about wars and alliances were made. Yet the human did not release her hand, his presence steady beside her, a quiet anchor in a sea of ancient authority. The central platform lifted them gently upward until they stood alone in the focus of every gaze. And for a moment no one spoke, because what had begun as a breach of protocol had now forced its way into the heart of galactic law. Finally a voice from the council emerged, layered and resonant, not belonging to a single being, but to the institution itself. It acknowledged the human's condition for attendance, and then turned its attention toward the girl. And when it spoke her species' name, the sound carried centuries of dismissal. It declared that the Luma had long ago been classified as non-essential to interstellar development, their abilities measured as economically and militarily negligible, their emotional sensitivity considered a destabilizing trait in high-conflict environments, and therefore their exclusion from central systems had been deemed necessary for the greater balance. Each word was spoken with the cold certainty of recorded history, and as the chamber's living crystal repeated the classification in faint echoes, the girl felt as if her entire existence was being reduced to a footnote. The human's hand tightened slightly around hers, but he did not interrupt. He waited, because he seemed to understand that something deeper was being revealed. The council continued, and its tone shifted from judgment to analysis. It explained that humanity's unexpected interest in a Luma individual had triggered the release of sealed archives, data that had not been reviewed for several cycles. And now those records were being projected into the chamber for all to witness. The crystal walls came alive with images from a distant past, showing early exploration fleets encountering the Luma homeworld, a world not rich in minerals or strategic position, but filled with cities built around vast luminous networks that connected every mind of their species. In a constant emotional exchange, the delegates watched as the recordings demonstrated how a single Luma could sense the fear of thousands in Comet, how they could stabilize entire populations during natural disasters simply by sharing their collective empathy, how conflict between rival groups dissolved when a Luma mediator entered the space and allowed each side to feel the other's pain as their own. The girl stared at the images in shock because she had never seen her people described with anything but quiet shame, and now their true nature unfolded above her like a lost identity. The Council's voice admitted that in the earliest expansion era, the Luma had been considered for a central role in interstellar diplomacy, not as soldiers or engineers, but as emotional harmonizers capable of preventing wars before they began. But the images shifted again and the tone darkened, showing the first major galactic conflict, a war so vast that empathy itself had been seen as a weakness. And in that era, the Luma had refused to take sides, had refused to weaponize their connection, had insisted on helping all wounded beings regardless of allegiance. And that choice had been interpreted by the dominant powers as a threat to strategic control, because a species that could dissolve hatred could not be commanded to sustain it. So the classification had been changed, their value erased from official records, their worlds pushed to the edges of trade routes, their existence reduced to an inconvenience that would slowly fade from relevance. The chamber fell into a stunned silence as the truth settled over it. The girl's entire life of rejection revealed not as a natural order, but as the result of a deliberate decision made by those who feared what her people represented. She felt the ground of her identity shift beneath her, every insult she had accepted now burning with a different meaning. Beside her, the human finally spoke, and his voice carried not anger, but a deep, steady sorrow. He said that his species had searched the stars for something they had nearly lost on their own world, the ability to feel the lives of others as important as their own, and that their historians had found fragments of the Luma story hidden in old data streams, a record of a people who believed that connection was stronger than conquest. And that was why he had walked to the outer ring of the transit hall, not by accident, but because humanity had come to find them. The revelation moved through the chamber like a rising tide, some delegates reacting with open alarm, because it meant the human's action had never been a spontaneous gesture. It had been the first step of a mission that challenged the moral foundation of the current galactic order. The Council demanded clarification, asking if humanity intended to reinstate the Luma as a central species. And the human answered that humanity intended to recognize value where it had been denied, because in the face of the unknown, fleet now approaching their shared space, strength alone would not be enough to hold the galaxy together. The girl's heart pounded as she realized that the reason he had chosen her seat was not pity, but recognition. She was not an exception. She was a living representative of something the galaxy had tried to forget, and before the Council could respond, a new transmission broke through the chamber's shields. The defensive command reporting that the unidentified fleet had ignored all hails and was deploying vessels toward the station. The time for political debate had ended and a real threat stood at their door. The chamber lights shifted to combat alert, and in that crimson glow, every delegate understood the terrible and perfect timing of the revelation, because the species once rejected for refusing to take sides in war was now standing in the center of the galaxy at the moment when unity would determine survival. All eyes turned toward the girl, not with dismissal, but with a growing realization that the hidden truth about her people might be the only force capable of holding the fractured alliances together. And she stood there trembling, no longer invisible, yet not knowing how to carry the weight of a destiny that had been denied to her entire life. The combat alert transformed the Council chamber from a place of judgment into a command center of survival. The living crystal walls now filled with real-time images of the unknown fleet advancing in perfect formation, dark vessels shaped like moving shadows that absorbed the light of the nearby stars. and for the first time since the human and the Luma girl had entered, the delegates stopped looking at them and turned their full attention to the threat that did not care about rank or protocol. Alarms rolled through every level of the station. Evacuation routes opened. Defense cannons rotated into firing positions. Fighter wings launched in bright streams of fire, and the air inside the chamber grew tight with the sharp scent of fear that no species could completely hide. The military representatives began speaking over one another, calculating firing ranges, shield strengths, casualty projections, each voice louder than the last, as if volume itself could create control. The Virex demanded immediate attack. The Scythery argued for negotiation. The Corps presented probability charts that ended in rising red lines, and through all of it the girl stood frozen at the center platform, feeling something she had never experienced before on such a scale. Not the rejection of a room, but the raw terror of thousands of beings at once. It moved through her like a storm of broken signals. Every heartbeat around the station echoing inside her mind. Every child crying in a distant corridor. Every soldier preparing for a battle they might not survive. Every leader terrified of making the wrong command. The overwhelming weight drove her to her knees as a silent cry escaped her chest, and at first the council mistook it for weakness. Another example of why her kind had been removed from positions of importance. But the human recognized a truth and moved beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, not to lift her, but to anchor her, because he understood that she was not collapsing. She was connecting, the emotional network of her species awakening in response to the shared panic of an entire station. The chamber lights flickered as the first exchange of fire lit the space beyond the crystal walls, a line of defensive cannons striking the leading enemy ship only to be absorbed by a shifting field that bent energy like water. The military voices rose in an open alarm, because their greatest weapons were doing nothing. The unknown fleet did not answer hails, did not change formation. It simply continued forward with a slow and unstoppable certainty. And that was when the fear inside the station reached its highest peak, a wave so strong that it should have shattered the fragile Luma mind. Yet instead of breaking, she began to glow, a soft expanding light that moved from her chest through her thin arms and into the air around her. The human felt it first as a warmth that pushed back the cold edge of panic. The delegates felt it next as they're racing. Thoughts slowed, their breathing steadied, their voices dropped from shouts to controlled commands. The effect spread outward through the chamber and into the corridors beyond, carried by the communication networks and the open channels. Every being who saw her image on their screen felt the same impossible calm settling over them, not removing the danger, but giving them the clarity to face it together. The Virex commander who had demanded immediate attack now spoke in measured tones, coordinating with the Scythery for shield harmonics. The Corps recalculated new strategies that had been impossible while their processors were overloaded with chaotic inputs. For the first time since the fleet had appeared, the station moved as a single unified entity instead of a collection of competing powers. And in the center of it all, the girl remained kneeling, her eyes closed, tears drifting from the corners as she carried the emotional weight of thousands and transformed it into something steady and strong. The human stayed beside her, not interfering, acting as a physical barrier between her and the rushing movement of officials. Because while her gift held the station together, his species' role was now clear in another way. The external screens showed human vessels moving into defensive positions at the most vulnerable points, placing themselves between the enemy and the civilian evacuation routes. Not because they were the strongest ships, but because they were willing to take. The first impact, the first direct strike from the Shadow fleet hit one of the outer platforms, the explosion blooming like a silent star. And the entire chamber felt the shock, yet the panic did not return. The girl's light held, her connection tightening. She could feel the grief of the lost lives, and instead of letting it break the unity, she turned it into a shared resolve that flowed through every mind. And that was when the impossible happened. The unknown fleet finally reacted. Their perfect formation faltered for a fraction of a second, as if the collective emotional signal of an entire station moving in harmony had disrupted whatever cold logic guided them. The core detected fluctuations in the enemy's shield pattern, a weakness that had not existed before, and the coordinated defense forces fired together, not as separate species, but as one synchronized strike. The impact forced the leading shadow vessel to retreat for the first time, a ripple of hope moving through the defenders. The council watched in stunned realization. Strength alone had failed, strategy alone had failed, but unity created by the one species they had cast aside was turning the battle. The girl's glow began to fade as the effort drained her fragile body, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling, because she was carrying more emotion than any Luma had ever been connected to at once. The human caught her as she began to fall, lowering her gently to the platform while the chamber continued to move with the calm she had given them. And as the second coordinated strike drove the enemy fleet back beyond immediate range, every delegate in the council understood that the balance of power in the galaxy had already changed, not because of a weapon or a fleet, but because the being they had once labeled as unwanted had just saved them all by giving them the one thing their strength could never create on its own: the ability to stand together without fear. When the last wave of enemy ships withdrew beyond the edge of the defense perimeter and the cannons of the station fell silent, the absence of battle noise felt almost unreal, as if the entire galaxy had paused to understand what had just happened. The council chamber remained filled with a soft fading glow from the Luma girl's body as she lay in the human's arms, her breathing slow but steady. And for the first time in recorded history, the High Council did not speak immediately, because every system present had seen the truth with their own eyes. Their survival had not come from their fleets or their ranks or their centuries of authority. It had come from the one being they had erased from importance. The chamber lights shifted from combat red to a new color that had never been used before, a warm white mixed with the faint silver of Luma energy. And medical units moved forward with a level of care usually reserved for heads of state. The human did not release her until they assured him she would be safe. And as they lifted her onto a floating support field, the delegates did something no protocol had ever required. They stood, row after row across every level, not in political display, but in a silent recognition that the definition of value had been rewritten in a single moment. The living crystal walls began replaying the events that had just unfolded, not as a record of battle, but as a record of unity, showing the instant when her light had spread through the station, when rival species had spoken as allies, when human ships had placed themselves in the line of fire without hesitation. And as those images circled the chamber, the voice of the council returned, no longer distant and layered, but clear and singular, for the first time choosing to be heard as individuals rather than an institution. They spoke her name, and the sound carried none of the old classification. It carried respect. They declared that the historical designation of the Luma species was not only inaccurate, but the result of a fear-driven era that had valued control over connection. They acknowledged that the decision to erase her people had weakened the galaxy rather than protecting it, and that the events of this day had revealed the true nature of strength, a strength that combined the human willingness to stand for another life with the Luma ability to unite many lives into one purpose. The chamber floor itself changed then, the central platform expanding and reshaping into a new form. Not a diplomatic stage and not a military command point, but a circular space with two equal positions at its heart, one marked by the symbol of humanity and the other by a newly restored symbol drawn from the ancient Luma networks. And the council asked the human to stand in his place, not as a delegate requesting entry, but as a founding ally. He stepped forward without pride, his eyes remaining on the girl as the medical field slowly lowered her to her feet, her strength returning in small, uncertain movements. She looked around the chamber as if expecting to wake from a dream, because every face that had once ignored her was now turned toward her with something she had never seen directed at her before. Patience. She tried to step back, to return to the edge where she believed she belonged, but the human extended his hand again, the same simple gesture that had changed her life in the transit hall. And this time, when she took it, the entire chamber witnessed it as the beginning of something new rather than a breach of order. Together they walked to the center, her steps still hesitant, yet growing firmer with each movement. The council's voice asked her if she accepted the restoration of her people as a protected and essential species of the interstellar community. The words were so large that for a moment she could not understand them. She had spent her life believing she had nothing to offer, and now the future of her entire kind stood in front of her waiting for an answer. She looked at the human and saw in his expression not expectation, but trust, the same trust he had shown when he first sat beside her. And she realized that this was the true gift he had given her, not status, not protection, but the belief that her voice mattered. She turned back to the council, and in a quiet but steady tone she accepted, not for herself alone, but for every Luma who had lived and faded in the shadows of history. At that moment, a signal spread through the entire station and beyond it into the communication networks of allied systems. The recording of the unwanted girl becoming the recognized heart of unity. In the outer hall where the empty seat still waited, the station workers placed a new marking beside it, not a warning of isolation, but a sign of honor. And across multiple worlds, Luma communities that had hidden for generations saw the transmission and stepped into the open for the first time, while in the council chamber. The final declaration was made that from this cycle forward, the central doctrine of interstellar cooperation would include the principle demonstrated by humanity and the Luma together, that no being would be measured only by power, and that empathy would stand equal to strength in all decisions of war and peace. The human moved slightly to the side then, not leaving her alone, but making space for her to stand fully visible at the center of the chamber, and every delegate present bowed there, heads in the first unified gesture of respect ever given to her species. She felt the echo of countless minds no longer filled with fear, but with recognition and gratitude. And in that overwhelming connection, she understood that the loneliness that had defined her life was gone, replaced by a living network that reached across the stars. The same place that had once been the seat no one would touch had become the symbol of a new era. And as the crystal walls recorded the moment for all future generations, the words that would be remembered above all others were spoken not by the council or by the human, but by the quiet girl who had once believed she was nothing, when she said that the day a human chose to sit beside her was the day the galaxy chose to see itself differently. And in the vast chamber where power had always spoken the loudest, the most important being in the room was the one who had been invisible, standing in the light with an entire civilization rising with her.